Hello, my name is Olu Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I want to give a quick rundown of all American presidents and be able to provide factoids on them before it gets dark. I don't know, I'm timing myself, let's be quick. First of all, George Washington was our first president. Of course, he was a tall man, stood about 6 feet 2.5 inches, and he was our commanding general. He had no children, and of course, that's enough said about George Washington. Our second president, John Adams, was not as tall as George Washington, but he was also vice president to George Washington. John Adams would be our first president to live to 90 years old, and for a long time he was the only one. He's the father of John Quincy Adams, who was our sixth president. John Adams had a very distinguished career as a diplomat on behalf of America while we were in the Revolutionary War. He later became ambassador to Great Britain. He negotiated with the French in helping us get loans. He and his wife hated the gut of our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Our third president was Thomas Jefferson. He stood at almost 6 feet 3. He was a very lanky man. He was mild-mannered in speech, and his nickname was Sage of Monticello. He was a very good writer, so he wrote our Declaration of Independence. He was nominated by John Adams, our second president, to write the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams had said that he chose him for his felicity of words. Of course, he went on to form one of our first two parties, that's the Democratic Republicans, who were also the anti-administration party, or the anti-federalists, in opposition to Alexander Hamilton's Federalists. Our fourth president was James Madison, another Virginian. So if you notice, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and after James Monroe, who's our fifth, they're all Virginians. So they are part of the Virginian dynasty. If you notice, among most of our first 10 presidents were from Virginia. So they normally call that the Virginia dynasty. In any event, James Madison is our shortest president ever. He stood at 5 feet 4. He was a very brilliant man, graduated from Princeton. He studied law on his own, even though he never qualified to become a lawyer. He never practiced law, but he got the books and he studied law, and he's called father of our Constitution. He gave us the Bill of Rights. So those are the first 10 amendments in the Constitution. He was a protege of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, had once been governor of Virginia, and he and James Madison were authors of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which would create controversy later on regarding states' rights. Let's move on. Our fifth president was James Monroe, another Virginian. James Monroe was another protege of Thomas Jefferson, and of course he's the one who executed the deal for the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase was under Thomas Jefferson's administration. Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of America, and with the purchase of over 820,000 square miles of land from the French. While James Monroe was an excellent negotiator on behalf of the United States, he didn't show as much financial acumen in his own finances, and he died in financial ruin. He died on 4th of July, 5 years after, to the day, 5 years after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on the same day, 4th of July, on the 50th anniversary of the United States independence. And our sixth president was John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is traditionally considered by historians, using historiometrics, as our president having the highest IQ. He was very fluent in several languages. I think almost seven languages. He was fluent in German, Russian, French, several languages, Dutch. And of course, he's a graduate of Harvard like his father, and he studied law, but he became a career diplomat. He'd been ambassador to Russia, amongst other things. He was Secretary of State, and of course, he had just one term, just like his father. Our seventh president was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had been a major general. He'd done a number of things. He'd been a senator, he'd been a lawyer, he was a blackguard, and he was our first president on which there was an assassination attempt. He survived an assassination attempt. I think the person misfired, or the bullet didn't come out, and so he ended up beating up his assailant with a cane. Now, our eighth president after Andrew Jackson was Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was a very small man. He was a New Yorker, and his wife, his wife passed before he took office, so he was a widow in office. So he served without his first lady. However, he was a tremendous organizer, and he was one of the founders of the Democratic Party. Now, later on, he would go on to join the Free Soilers Party, and he had a significant. He ran as a third party candidate for presidency much later on, and he was a serious contender. I think he won as many as 10% of the votes. After Martin Van Buren came William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison, he had the longest speech, but he had the shortest tenure as president. He became president around the age of 68. He died of pneumonia. He still goes on record for a president with the longest inaugural speech. He was of the Whig Party. He was the first presidential candidate who successfully ran on the Whig Party. So his vice president took over. That was John Tyler. John Tyler, he was kicked out of the Whig Party. Briefly, he joined the Confederacy, and he died. He's the only president who died because he sworn allegiance to the Confederacy government that was seceding. He's the only president who had a foreign flag draped over his casket. But after John Tyler was something I also want to mention about John Tyler. He set the precedent because after William Henry Harrison died in office, he was the first president to die in office. The Constitution was rather vague. If the vice president was a vice president acting as president, John Tyler was insistent. He was insistent. He was firm that no, he had taken over and become the new president. He was not a vice president acting as president. Now, subsequently, with the 25th Amendment that would come, it would clarify things, the succession, but that wouldn't come until about 1967. In any event, after John Tyler was James Knox Polk. James Knox Polk had planned on having just one term, and he had four programs, four policies, 4 items on his agenda that he planned on accomplishing while president, and he succeeded. He planned to have just one term, and he had just one term. He had been a protege of Andrew Jackson, and he was a very effective president. Of course, he presided over the Mexican-American War, so he also gave us Alta California. He died just a few months after leaving office of cholera. He had no children. That's James Knox Polk. He was a slaveholder as well, unfortunately. After James Knox Polk was Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor was a general like William Henry Harrison, but he died after eating contaminated berries, poison berries. He died, about a year shortly after taking office, and his vice president, Millard Fillmore, another New Yorker would take office. After Millard Fillmore was from New York, kind of bland, one of our worst presidents. He would become part of a very, later on when he tried to run for office again, because he lost, he lost his, he was not able to succeed in his own, in his own rights to run, as a candidate in his own capacity for president. But much later on, he would join a very nativist party that was very racist. So that was much later on. And after Millard Fillmore, after Millard Fillmore was, after Millard Fillmore was Franklin Pierce. I'm not keeping count of the numbers. Franklin Pierce was our 14th president. Franklin Pierce, unfortunately, was an alcoholic. He was from New Hampshire. He'd been governor. His son would die in his presence, and in him and his wife's presence, in an unfortunate train accident. His son would die, and he himself, during the Mexican-American War, he'd actually his horse was shot from under him, and so it landed on him, and so he passed out. He fainted during the war, and he would have to, even though he won accolades and awards for his service, for bravery, but throughout his life he had to defend himself because people ridiculed him. His men accused him of not showing bravery for passing out, but he didn't pass out because he was scared. He passed out from the pain of his horse being shot off from under him. He was also an alcoholic. Now, after Pierce is also distantly related to Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush, that's the mother of President George Bush, our 43rd president. Barbara Bush's maiden name is Pierce. After Franklin Pierce was James Buchanan. James Buchanan was our only bachelor in office, and of course one of our worst presidents. He didn't do much. He had just one term, just like Franklin Pierce as well, had just one term, and the South was threatening to secede over the expansion of slavery, and so he felt that even though he didn't want the South to secede, but he didn't think as president that he had the power to prevent them. Fortunately, though, our 16th president was Abraham Lincoln. He was the first. He was our tallest president, 6'4". Of course, my favorite president. A lot of people's favorite presidents. He's routinely ranked as our #1 president. Of course, he was a very firm president. He apparently is considered one of our most authoritarian presidents. He got a lot done despite the war. He passed the Homestead Act, which gave free land to people who were moving westward. He passed the Railroad Act, to build the railroads from all the way to the West Coast, and that helped the cause of the war. He also gave land grants, to create new colleges. So Abraham Lincoln achieved a lot apart from saving the Union. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. After him, his vice president, who was his second vice president, Andrew Johnson, who had been a tailor, took over. He had been a territorial governor of the territory of Tennessee. He was drunk on his swearing in as vice president. He's normally remembered for that, so it was it's considered a very disgraceful event. He's our first president to have been impeached as well. After him was our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is normally said to have been an alcoholic. I've read his personal memoirs. He was a very talented writer. He was a graduate of West Point, and of course he saved the Union. He created the Department of Justice to actually prosecute the KKK, and he of course was president when the Reconstruction era acts, the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, several amendments were passed under him. By the way, something I wanted to mention about Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was president when Alaska was purchased from the Russians. Now, so Ulysses S. Grant tried to enforce, he used federal troops to try to enforce the protection of African Americans and to ensure that their 14th Amendment rights, their 15th Amendment rights were all protected. So he sent federal troops to the South. Of course, that was the Reconstruction era. He tried to get a third term. He had 2 terms, but unfortunately his administration goes down as being one of the most corrupt. But he was above board. There was no corruption in him. In fact, he died a poor man. It was a reason why Mark Twain approached him about writing his memoirs, which he did. I've read personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. It goes down. It's one of the great American classics, and he's an excellent writer. He doesn't write about his presidency. He writes about his life, and especially the execution of the Civil War. Wow, the bugs are biting me, so I apologize that I'm fidgeting. There are lots of bugs out here. I'm actually in front of a garden. There's a garden out here, and so of course there are lots of bugs around. Well, let's move on. So after Ulysses S. Grant, he tried to get a third term, but he didn't. So of course there were stalwarts. The Republican Party had started breaking up into factions, and the stalwarts wanted to get a third term for Ulysses S. Grant, but they were unsuccessful. After Ulysses S. Grant was Rutherford B. Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes was a lawyer. He was a war hero, and he had just 1 term. He promised to have 1 term. He's the only president. He was actually elected by a commission by just 1 vote, because his opponent was Samuel Tilden of New York, and of course he did the compromises, the main act of the compromise of 1877. Where he agreed that if the Southern Democrats would accept his presidency and not block the votes, he would pull out federal troops from the South, and of course that led to Jim Crow laws and white supremacy in the South. So that's Rutherford B. Hayes, who had been a lawyer, and of course he graduated from Harvard Law School. After Rutherford B. Hayes was James Garfield. James Garfield was our 20th president. Unfortunately, he was assassinated by a lunatic, Charles Guiteau, a guy who was looking for a job. There was the spoil system back then, and Charles Guiteau was under the delusion that he got James Garfield elected president, and James Garfield would give him a job after becoming president, but this didn't pan out, and so Guiteau shot him. Guiteau had written something like a speech, something mini trivial, and he claimed to have written a speech on his behalf or whatever, and so he was a lunatic, and so he killed James Garfield. He shot him. So James Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur, who had once been the collector of the Port of New York and had no presidential aspirations whatsoever, ended up becoming president, and so because of that he reformed the civil service. There was something called the spoil system and the patronage system, which was very corrupt, and so due to the unfortunate assassination of James Garfield, he was forced to reform the civil service, through which he had benefited. He had benefited from the spoil system of the civil service, which was highly corrupt. He ordered investigations as well of the very corrupt civil service at the time. So and after Chester A. Arthur, he also let me mention, he passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was a very racist law, which was excluding, it banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. It was subsequently extended, later on. All of these, those such racist immigration acts, were, of course, were later on done away with in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson's Immigration and Nationality Act. But anyway, let's move forward from Chester A. Arthur. After Chester A. Arthur, who was our 21st president, was our president Grover Cleveland, who was a Democrat. He was the first Democrat to become president after, he was a Northerner though, he was the first Democrat to become president after the Civil War. He was the first president to have two non-consecutive terms, so it was our 22nd and 24th president. Now, I have to be moving faster. So after Grover Cleveland was Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was passionate about civil rights and had wanted to help advocate for the funding of black education, because he thought education would help black people to become equal in society, in fact, with whites. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to get an education bill to fund black education, during his tenure. People normally rank him as a below average president because shortly after his tenure, America got into a deep recession. And so Benjamin Harrison, is not considered one of our most effective presidents in any event. He was a Republican, and of course after him, his previous rival and the president before him, Grover Cleveland, defeated him again. So and after Grover Cleveland was President William McKinley. President William McKinley was an effective president. He presided over the Spanish-American War, in which America would now seize Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now he initiated the building of the investigations into the building of the Panama Canal. Of course, the French were the ones who were building the Panama Canal at the time, but unfortunately, he was assassinated after he had won his second term, by an anarchist. So it meant, Theodore Roosevelt that was the first of the Roosevelts, would go on to, become president. Theodore Roosevelt came from, an elite family, an elite Roosevelt family. He was from New York. He went to Harvard himself. He went on to Columbia Law School, but he dropped out to go into politics. Theodore Roosevelt, he achieved a lot. He became a trust buster. He went after the trusts. Now, one thing Benjamin Harrison did as our 23rd president was he passed the Sherman Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Now, he didn't give it teeth though, Teddy Roosevelt would enforce the Sherman Act and start going against the big corporations, because this was the era of the Rockefellers, right? John D. Rockefeller, the robber barons, the tycoons. There was a lot of corruption. Of course, the politicians were in the pockets of the robber barons. Now, that was one thing Teddy Roosevelt did. He was very brave, and he went after the robber barons. He went after the big trusts and started breaking them up and going after the monopolies. And so he was a progressive era president, even though he was a Republican. And so he started to champion the cause of the common man. He was also into conservation. So he built forest parks and things like that. Now, after he's on Mount Rushmore, by the way, he's typically ranked amongst the top 5 U.S. presidents. Now, after Teddy Roosevelt, his protege, his handpicked guy, who was he'd been Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. He's known as the heaviest president. He was our heaviest person in the White House. William Howard Taft. He was also governor of the Philippines. Reluctantly, he had acceded to run for office, and he became president. But soon after, Teddy Roosevelt wanted his job back, and he split up the Republican Party by forming the Progressive Party, which was also known as the Bull Moose Party. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt was shot during the campaign. He was shot in the chest. Fortunately, his spectacles case sort of deflected things. Even though he had a flesh wound, he would continue with his speech. Teddy was a bit crazy, yeah. Unfortunately, he split up the Republican vote, and Woodrow Wilson would go on to win and become our 28th president. Howard Taft also is the only U.S. president who after his presidency, went on to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, Teddy, Woodrow Wilson was a professor at Princeton. He's the only president who had a PhD, had a law degree, most educated president we've ever had. And our presidents have been very smart, but he had many degrees. He was governor of New Jersey. He became president of Princeton, and he was the architect of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the Senate would not accede to join the League of Nations. The League of Nations is sort of like the precursor of we have today, the United Nations, which Roosevelt, Churchill helped to craft, and which we have today, which was created after the Second World War. So there was a League of Nations. They had the 14 points. This was after the First World War. But let me move on. He also passed a racist immigration act, which barred attempted to bar Asians right from coming to America. Now after Woodrow Wilson was Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding was a Republican. Wilson had been a Democrat. He was a Democrat from the South. So Warren G. Harding was a guy from Ohio. He had the Ohio gang. He died. He was a notorious womanizer. He had a massive landslide. So Teddy Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson have had the highest, most massive popular votes proportion in the history of the presidency. So he was massively popular when he was alive, but he was very ineffective. There was a lot of corruption. It was in his cabinet that the first cabinet member was convicted of a crime and he had to go to prison. He died during the Teapot Dome scandal, and they say maybe his wife poisoned him because he was a notorious womanizer. She was the last person in the bedroom with him. It's not sure. People are not sure if he had a heart attack or if he was really poisoned. But in any event, he died in office, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, very silent man, very reticent. They said he hardly said a word. He was a lawyer from Massachusetts. He had been governor of Massachusetts. Calvin Coolidge, he became president, and he did a lot. He invested in funding he got congressional funding for historically black colleges, including Howard University. He tried to advance civil rights. He like Warren G. Harding, they both tried to pass anti-lynching laws, but they were unsuccessful. He didn't want to run again for office. He was tired with being president. And after Calvin Coolidge was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover had been a very effective administrator. He was a self-made millionaire. He was our first president to have gone to Stanford. He was an engineer. He had been a miner. He made a lot of money from mining. And of course, he traveled all over the world. He lived in England. He'd been a very dynamic, effective administrator. Unfortunately, he ranks as one of our worst presidents because the Great Depression happened in his era. The Great Depression happened in his era. It is said that it was Andrew Mellon who was Secretary of State under Calvin Coolidge. It was his policies of the trickle-down, scientific taxation that probably trickled into the presidency of Herbert Hoover and caused the Great Depression. Now, something I didn't mention was taxation was federal income taxation was passed. It was the 16th Amendment, was passed in 1913 during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, and tax was as high as 91%. 91% was the highest marginal tax rate. Now, Andrew Mellon, during President Calvin Coolidge, he wanted to do away with taxation of the wealthy because he believed that if you didn't tax the wealthy, it would allow them, their free money, they would invest it in the economy and it would create jobs. However, what it did was it caused the rich, the wealthy, to start investing, speculating. They were speculating on the stock market, and of course the market, when there was a bubble and the market crashed, it caused the Great Depression. So Herbert Hoover is notorious for the Hooverville. When the veterans went to camp out in Washington D.C., expecting their bonuses from the First World War, from the wars which they had been promised, he ordered the army. It is said, and General Douglas MacArthur rode on a horse, and they dispersed them, violently, spraying tear gas, injuring the veterans. So unfortunately, he lost in a landslide to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was like a fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He came from a patrician, wealthy family. His father had been a railroad executive, and unfortunately, he developed adult, polio in midlife. It's funny, he had won a kicking contest, right? He had an award for a kicking contest. He had been a very tall youth. He went to Harvard like his cousin. He went to Columbia Law. He dropped out of law school as well. There's something about the Roosevelts dropping out. They become very restless and drop out of law school. So he dropped out of law school, but he passed the bar exam. So he was an attorney. He was bored with it, and of course he went into politics like his cousin. He became assistant secretary of the Navy. Now he became governor of New York, and he won. He's the only president who won 4 terms, and of course he implemented under subterfuge the Manhattan Project, which was of course the development of the atomic bombs, the nuclear bombs, and his vice president didn't know of it. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage just shortly after winning his 4th term in 1945. He passed a lot of aggressive welfare and social programs to tackle the Great Depression, and they were known as the New Deal, right? The New Deal package. And so when he died, Harry Truman took over. Harry Truman took over, and Harry Truman was the one who made the unfortunate decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki against the Japanese during the Second World War. So it's the only time the atomic bomb has ever been used. He did desegregate the military anyway. Now, after him was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower had been general, the supreme commander of the Expeditionary Allied Forces, which is what the Allies were called during the Second World War. He was a 5-star general. He's one of only 5 5-star generals in American history. He, of course, Brown v. Board was passed under him, and of course he would use federal troops to enforce enforce integration in the South. And so he's widely known for this. He also initiated the largest infrastructure project in American history. That's the building of the interstate highways, now, which cost about $114 billion. After Eisenhower, who had 2 terms, his vice president, by the way, was Richard Nixon, and his vice president lost by about 114,000 popular votes to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy had an ambitious program in civil rights. He also had the plan to land, a man on the moon. Of course, the Russians, USSR had launched, a satellite in space with Sputnik, and so America needed to catch up and outdo them. And he planned, he promised to land a man on the moon. Unfortunately, he was assassinated after the Bay of Pigs, right? The Bay of Pigs invasion, in which, anti-Castro Cubans had tried to invade Cuba and to overthrow the government of Fidel Castro. And of course, he's also known for the Cuban Missile Crisis standoff, right? And the USSR had to back down. They had placed, they're trying to place, nuclear arms in Cuba, and so there was a standoff. He blockaded Cuba. He's known for that. He was firm, and Cuba, the USSR backed down. Unfortunately, John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, would take over. Lyndon B. Johnson is known for his Great Society programs. He passed massive welfare legislation. He did a fantastic job. It's getting dark, but I should be over soon. He passed massive welfare programs known as the Great Society program. Of course, he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He passed the Human and Urban Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, and a lot of other things, including a gun control act. He did a lot of he did a lot of great things domestically. Unfortunately, his Waterloo was Vietnam. He escalated the Vietnam War, and he was after his presidency was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon became president in 1968. Richard Nixon, unfortunately, he's known for the Watergate scandal, and he had to resign, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, would take over. And Gerald Ford was not able to win. He pardoned Nixon, and he'd been a congressman. He was a Yale graduate. He was a lawyer. He never knew his real dad. His real dad had actually been a millionaire, but he met his real dad, and he didn't like him. But his real dad was a very wealthy millionaire, and he was raised by somebody else, and he took the name of his stepfather. But after Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter would beat him. Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer in the Navy, and he'd been a governor in Georgia. He came into office talking about cleaning up corruption, and he was a very religious man, and he had good intentions. Unfortunately, he was defeated by Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan defeated him in and after Ronald Reagan would have 2 terms. Ronald Reagan had been president of the Actors Guild. He'd been an actor. People normally call him a B-list actor. He wasn't. He actually briefly became an A-list actor. But unfortunately, this also coincided with the Second World War, and he had to do his duty, and in the military. He didn't actually see action. He did his service in this Hollywood studios by doing advertisements, and that's Ronald Reagan. He's also known for the Iran-Contra affair scandal. Of course, he did. His vice president would go on to succeed him, and that was the first of the Bushes, George H.W. Bush. He'd gone to Yale. He'd served in the Navy. He'd been an he'd flown aircrafts, and he had just one term. And of course his son, he had one term. He took us to the Gulf War. After the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, and it was a very technologically advanced, very expeditious war, and America hardly had casualties, and so unfortunately he was defeated by Bill Clinton, who was from governor of Arkansas. Bill Clinton had been governor of Arkansas while he was at 29, and I think George H.W. Bush had said something about "Read my lips, no more taxes." It came back to bite him. I'd been saying something about taxes later on, but anyway, that was much earlier. But let me move on so we could finish this real quick. And after, it's getting dark. But anyway, after H.W. Bush was Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton, of course, was the second president to be impeached over a salacious sexual scandal with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. He had 2 terms. Of course, his wife was Hillary Clinton, the only woman who she won the popular vote against Donald Trump in 2016 elections. He won even though she won the popular vote, she lost she won the elections because she didn't win the Electoral College. Now, after Bill Clinton was George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. He was the first son. He had been governor of Texas, and of course 9/11 happened under his watch, and of course he led us to the Iraqi war, which led to the capture and eventual execution of Saddam Hussein by his people. Unfortunately, you know, he's remembered for, you know, the sort of like the lies that were told to get us into the Iraq war. And after him was Barack Obama. Barack Obama is our only African American president. His father was a Harvard grad who studied economics. He was from Kenya, and his mom was white. So Barack Obama won 2 terms. He defeated John McCain, a war hero, and he defeated Mitt Romney, who had been governor of Massachusetts. After Barack Obama was President Donald Trump, who is also our current president. He's the second president to have been had 2 non-consecutive terms. So in between, after Donald Trump's first term, he lost to Joe Biden. President Joe Biden had been Barack Obama's vice president. He was a Senate stalwart. He was a senator for a very long time. He's the first president to have made a black American woman a Supreme Court justice. So he made, with the appointment of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's a double Harvard graduate. And Joe Biden's son, of course, was a war hero. He'd been in the military. He died of brain cancer, and of course, after Joe Biden, our 45th president became 47th president, and that's Donald Trump. So there you have it. I said something about all our presidents. By the way, Donald Trump had been he'd been a television personality. He'd served on The Apprentice, and I liked The Apprentice at the time. My name's Olu Osha, and I've just given you a rundown of American presidents. It's dark now, and I don't know how I can make this lighter, but I'll keep you posted. I also draw attention to call of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts. My rights, my fundamental rights, have been violated through an abusive process in Montgomery County, Maryland. I've been framed by Montgomery County Police, and a man called Jide Wari perjured an emergency evaluation petition. He made up of fabrications which ostensibly led white cops to come and attack me, dehumanize me, assault me in my own home, and where they spread disinformation after gaslighting me and assaulting me, shooting taser darts to my head, almost killing me. In any event, my rights remain violated in Montgomery County, Maryland. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.